Today we're going to go back in time to 2003, not that long ago. And this is actually a page from my own history book for a change. A little story from my life. I want to tell you about a time that I was really scared. It was in 2003. I was a young lieutenant in the military at the time. And like a lot of folks in the military, back in 2003, everybody was kind of huddled on in Kuwait, crammed together in camps, waiting for George W. Bush to make his decision on whether or not we were going to invade Iraq. Now, of course, it was a foregone conclusion. Everybody knew it. I mean, the whole nonsense about, I haven't made my decision yet. It was just a bunch of crap. Everybody knew it was going to happen. And it was a matter of when and not if. And so in those days, right after Bush gave the order to go north, Saddam Hussein knew that he was finished. He knew the game was over, and he was desperate. And so he started launching these Scud missiles. You may remember those are the things that were kind of widely touted in the media as had this whole arsenal of Scud missiles, and they were huge impact and dangerous and all these things. And he just started launching these things like crazy south at all the invading armies of the coalition of the willing. And for me, this happened very early on. I mean, there were a lot of forces were still actually even in Kuwait at the time. A lot of units hadn't even crossed the line of departure yet. And for me, that was actually very scary because missiles are something kind of interesting. You can't get down behind a rock, or you can't shoot back. There's nothing really you can do. And I remember actually these sirens going off, warning everybody about this missile strike. And all these Scud missiles were heading our way. And I remember walking outside, looking up at the sky, and all I thought was, well, I hope I don't die. Because there wasn't really anything to do. There's nothing I knew that I could do. I couldn't stop the missiles. I couldn't put on my Iron Man suit and fly up into the sky and turn the missiles back into whatever other dimension. It's not like it is in the movies. It's not like Iron Man and Superman and all this stuff where they stop these missiles. There was nothing I could do. I had zero control over the situation. I couldn't hide from it. I couldn't protect myself. I couldn't shoot back. You just sort of hoped that they missed. And fortunately, at least for me, they did. And, the Patriot missile systems were able to do their jobs, and everything turned out okay. But I'll be the first to admit that for me, that was actually really scary. It was a feeling of complete and total helplessness, of fear. I'm not going to tell any tough guy stories about how I was unfazed or anything like that. That was actually a very scary moment in my life. And I was thinking about that these last days, obviously in relation to what's been happening around the world, because it is scary. And I can only begin to imagine how helpless, angry, the emotion that come out of being attacked in a way, bombs going off and all these things in where just it's nothing but innocent civilians around everywhere. I mean, in our case, we were in a war zone. And so, we sort of knew what to expect. I mean, this is levels beyond that. What happens in Paris and Beirut and so forth, this is levels beyond that. So I can only begin to imagine the fear and the helplessness and the anger that stems from being involved in something like that, happening in your backyard, in your neighborhood. The emotion just has to be palatable. And it's totally understandable. The entire world, it feels like, is now on this war footing. And everybody, and again, even that's understandable. People want somebody's ass kicked. They're angry. They're scared. They kind of throw their hands up and say, enough is enough. We need to do something. We need to go kick somebody's ass. We need to go invade somebody. We need to go bomb somebody. We got to do something about this. And that is understandable. People want the problem to go away. They don't want to have to deal with this anymore. They don't want to have to deal with the prospect of going out to the movies or going out to dinner, and 1 minute they're enjoying their lives, and the next minute it's, again, fear, chaos, blood, and death, and it's just nobody wants to live like that. They want the problem to go away, and they want the government to make the problem go away. And that's exactly what's happening now. The world is on war footing. Everything's being mobilized. Defense contractors' stock prices are going through the roof. It's happening. And again, it's understandable because there's a lot of emotion involved. And there's a few points that I really want to make from all of this to try and lend some reason to what's happening. And that's really primarily the first, is that emotional decisions tend to be bad decisions. And I think we can all agree on that. We can draw from experiences in our own lives personally that emotional decisions tend to be very bad decisions in anything. When you think about anything really, if you have to go under the knife, you don't want to deal with an emotional surgeon. When you're investing and you make investment decisions, when you're emotional, you tend to lose all of your money. It tends to work out very poorly. When you sell high quality assets because you're afraid and you buy low quality assets because you're greedy, that tends to work out pretty poorly. Anything we do emotionally, emotional decisions that are made tend to not work out very well. They tend to be bad decisions. The only times really people kind of excel under times of great stress, emotion, particularly when those emotions are negative, when they're angry. The only times we excel when we're angry is when we have to do things that are, frankly, violent. When you see professional athletes, get each other pumped up, they get angry, so forth, before they go, and you got 350-pound guys crashing into other 350-pound guys. Yeah, maybe anger works pretty well when it's all about violence and destruction. But we're looking for positive outcomes. Emotional decisions are bad decisions. And these are decisions that are being made emotionally. These desires to go to war, these are emotional calls. The second point that I want to make is that, again, we have to be pretty honest with ourselves and realize that, frankly, these types of attacks occur almost on an everyday basis, in some cases several times a day in many parts of the world. You don't really ever hear about it. But the fact is there's violence all over the world where there's bad, sick, demented, twisted people who want to kill innocent civilians. You don't really ever hear about it unless it occurs in rich, predominantly white Western nations. It's just like what we talked about a couple of weeks ago with gun violence. When gun violence occurs in poor neighborhoods dominated by ethnic minorities, nobody ever really hears about it, even though it happens almost on a daily basis all over the United States. But when it's a predominantly white, upper middle class, suburban kind of environment, and some sick, twisted guy goes in and shoots up a school or a movie theater or whatever, then people go nuts, even though it happens on a regular basis. And of course it's terrifying. It's terrifying to think that there are all these angry people out there who want to do us harm. That is the way of it. That's the way, in many respects, it's always been. We can go back to the origins of recorded human history and see that it's almost always been this way. That the Romans had to deal with this. They didn't call them terrorists. They called them barbarians. And they had to deal with this constant threat of these total whack jobs, these guys who were uncivilized and who knows what the hell they believed in. They were crazy. And they would come down and they would just vanquish countrysides. And people lived in fear of this thing, of this idea of the barbarians. And they got it again, there was the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and the Vandals and the Huns. And when the Huns came around, this was a time that, in many respects, was the most dangerous time in all of human history up to that point. And people were terrified, lived their entire lives in fear that the Huns were coming, that the Vandals were coming, that the barbarians were coming. And then they got it again later and later and later. 1,000 years later, they had to deal with the Mongols, who were even more terrible than the Huns. And it was more and more and more all the time. Human beings have always had to deal with this, particularly, the most dominant, richest civilizations kind of have a target on their back. And they've always had to deal with this thing. We have to deal with it now in our modern times. And yet, even still, if you look at it realistically, it is terrifying. But statistically speaking, it's an extremely low-risk event. If you look at the statistics, and by the way, the U.S. government provides this itself. The U.S. government has an agency called the National Counterterrorism Center. They provide statistics on this. This isn't Simon Black's numbers. This is the United States government's own figures through its own counterterrorism center, saying that your chances of being killed in a terrorist attack are about 1 in 20 million. You have a much higher likelihood of being struck by lightning, or being killed in a shark attack, or being shot by a police officer, or to be killed in a Black Friday stampede. These are much greater risks, statistically speaking, than getting killed in a terrorist attack, or even ever even seeing a terrorist. There were more people killed in 2001 by hippopotamuses than in terrorist attacks. And it's not to make light of what happened. It's not to make light of any of this stuff. But if you look at the statistical likelihood, bizarre things, getting crushed by your own television set is more likely than getting killed by a terrorist attack. These are the government's own numbers. And so to feel so much fear for something that's so, that has such an infinitesimally small likelihood of ever occurring, creates the conditions to make emotional decisions which tend to be bad decisions. Another point I want to make, that I tend to point out a lot, is to always be careful what you wish for. Governments do have a tendency to never let a crisis go to waste, and we are already seeing that. One of the greatest things to happen to the world over the last few years were the, I think, NSA revelations by Edward Snowden. This is a person who gave up a whole hell of a lot, his personal freedom and privacy and everything, as a sacrifice to let the world know what was happening, to let the world know that you were being illegally and mercilessly spied upon by your own governments on a regular basis, that they are violating the law for their own ends. And of course now the intelligence community is gripping hands and coming together saying Edward Snowden has blood on his hands. Former CIA chief James Woolsey saying that Edward Snowden has blood on his hands. It's all his fault. And they talk about this saying, the discussion, the debate on encryption for so long has been cast through the lens of Edward Snowden, and now it will be set through the lens of Paris. Basically saying, well, everybody was kind of against this encryption for so long, and or against government surveillance and so forth, and now we're going to change, and now we're going to recast the entire debate and say, look at what happens when people have encryption. Look at what happens when we don't have, when suddenly we have to be accountable to the public. Look at what happens. This is the sort of thing that happens when we have to be held accountable for our illegal spying activities, when we have to be held accountable to the public. And when the public knows that we're illegally spying on them, this is the sort of thing that happens. We have to put a stop to it. And it's utterly insane. For the current CIA director is a guy named John Brennan, who, by the way, is the same person who had his email hacked not too long ago by a 13-year-old kid, is the same kind of person saying that, it's actually kind of funny. It's not to say that the government doesn't like encryption. They just don't like you and I having encryption. They like their own encryption just fine. As long as you or I have it, then it's a big problem. But I find it so completely disingenuous. It's so hollow and pathetic for them to say they had been collecting exabytes and petabytes of data to the point they collected so much data. They've got this huge NSA surveillance center, and they're collecting so much data on every phone call, every email, every web search that happens across the world. And they're collecting all this and archiving. They're collecting so much data that the computers are literally lighting on fire. There's arcs of flames in their data center. There's just so much stuff going through there. And yet they don't have enough information. They're trying to tell the world that they don't have enough information in order to stop these attacks. And I find that so hollow and disingenuous and completely and utterly pathetic. How much information do you have to collect before you say that you have enough information to actually do your job? It's completely ridiculous. That's the world that I come from. I used to be an intelligence officer. I used to be in that position chasing around terrorists and trying to figure all this stuff out. It just doesn't, none of these things make any sense. I have to say myself, and I've I wrote about this some time ago. I'm myself extremely suspicious of the Islamic State to begin with. There's just too many things that don't add up. And yes, there is some credible evidence that there's government involvement at a minimum in their arming. There's a lot of credible evidence in terms of where did ISIS get all of its weaponry from. But there's still too many things that don't add up. The fact that I mentioned this some months ago. I mean, suddenly ISIS didn't exist. Nobody had heard of them. And within a couple of months, they were the biggest scare in the world, taking over huge swaths of Iraq. And I looked and said, this doesn't make any sense. That ISIS is able to take over more land at a faster rate than the United States military? Really? That doesn't make any sense. The desert's a big place. You can't just go and drive through it and just take over all this. It's just not how it works. The 3rd Infantry Division rolled through southern Iraq. It took them more time to take over Iraq. The supply trains and fuel and all these things have to take place. And in a bunch of guys in SUVs is able to go through and take over a whole country. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. And there's a lot of things here that don't add up. But more of what we're seeing now, we're seeing again, there's this recast of the discussion. It's like, hey, forget about all those things that don't make sense. Forget about the lack of facts. Forget about all these things. We need to have another discussion on encryption. Or one of my favorite things now is something that a lot of European countries have slid in. Of course, the usual suspects: France, Italy, Spain, etc. All these broke countries now, they have requirements. They're in the Eurozone. They have requirements. They have to run. Budgets in a certain way. They're not allowed to take on deficits that are too big in order to maintain their status within the European Union and the Eurozone and so forth. But they're using this emergency. They're saying we're in a state of emergency, so we're going to suspend all of our budget requirements. We don't have to run responsible budgets now because we're in a state of emergency. So who's doing that? France, Italy, Spain, all the bankrupt countries are latching on to this crisis and saying, oh, we're in a state of emergency, so we don't have to run a balanced budget. We don't have to worry about how much money we're spending. We don't have to worry about how much we're indebting future generations. So they're actually suspending their budget requirements. And I'm sorry, but what does one thing have to do with another? 150 people died, and that's horrible. What does it have to do with your budget? What does it have to do with saying, oh, well, we're not going to run anywhere near a responsible budget for the next 10 years? What does one thing have to do with another? It doesn't. But this is what happens. When people get emotional and they say, we want action, again, be careful what you wish for, because governments have a tendency to never let these crises go to waste. And they do things that they wouldn't ordinarily be able to do. And it's usually not positive because, again, emotional decisions are bad decisions and the results from them tend to be negative. Another point I want to make along those lines is that these things tend to get extremely expensive. You look at the war on terror. It has cost trillions and trillions of dollars just in direct costs. Not even talking about indirect costs and opportunity costs or any of these sorts of things, just in the direct costs. The wars themselves, the invasions, all these things cost trillions of dollars. And even if you forget about the dollars, who gives a shit about the paper currency? How many lives have been lost as a result? 3,000 people lost their lives on 9/11. Tens of thousands of people have died in the 15, 14 years since as a result of this. Trillions of dollars, tens of thousands of people. It just doesn't add up. If you take an objective, unemotional, rational view, it just doesn't add up. Now, let's be honest, it's not even very effective. You go to war for 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 years, you invade all these other countries, and what do you realize? 14 years later, you realize that all you're in is living in a more dangerous world where these things still exist. You've got a shitload of debt. A lot of people have died, way more people than died in the attacks themselves. You've indebted future generations to the tune of trillions of dollars to protect people from something that has a lower statistical likelihood than getting struck by lightning. More people died last year choking on hot dogs than died in a terrorist attack. Now, if you told people that we were going to spend trillions of dollars that we didn't have, governments are broke. I mean, that's a fact. Again, that's not a Simon Black assertion. These governments themselves, you look at the balance sheets, the financial statements by France and Italy and the United States and so forth, all these countries that are trying to deal with this now, they're all broke. Their own financial statements show that they're broke. They're running out of money. And if you go and tell people, if Monsieur Hollande or Barack Obama came and said, we're going to spend trillions of dollars to fight a war on hot dogs. You think these people were nuts. And they'd say, all these people died from choking on hot dogs. We need a war on hot dogs. And you think they were nuts. But terrorists are a lot scarier than hot dogs. You know, you put an angry brown guy on a YouTube video firing an AK-47 in the air. People are so scared, they'll do anything. They say, yeah, sure, let's spend trillions of dollars, but replace that with hot dogs. And just ask yourself, what kind of sense does it make? Yes, it's scary, and it's just horrible that people die and have to suffer the indignity and the fear and the feeling of helplessness that goes along with that. But again, emotional reactions, emotional decisions tend to not be good decisions. Another point that I'd like to bring up is that it's never, ever, ever so black and white. The solutions are not black and white. We say, let's go bomb them. Let's bomb them. You know, let's send in the United States Marine Corps and just kill every last one of those guys. And that sounds great. That sounds great. You know, if it were like a video game and you could just kind of put your finger on a grid square and click a button and just annihilate all the bad people. You know, you just go around and you click a button, you mark all the bad people, and, you know, you blow them up, and that's it. Mission accomplished. But that's not how it works. It's not like there's a couple of thousand guys sitting around in the middle of a desert in no way, shape, or form are there innocent civilians, hospitals or schools and children and so forth anywhere near them. It's just a bunch of guys standing around in a circle holding a big sign that says, please bomb me. That's not how it works. This is the real world. It's not a movie. There's not some good-looking actor with big biceps who's going to run in and just, snipe all the terrorists. He's going to one-hand his big machine gun, kill all the bad guys, go back and get the save the pretty girl, and then they roll the credits. That's just not how it works. That's not how it works in the real world. I was thinking about this actually, and the best analogy that I could think of, I'm a big history guy, and as I kind of look to history, there's so many examples through history. You can look at the barbarians, you can look at the Mongols, you can look at all these, but I think actually one that's very interesting is an American analogy. A couple of hundred years ago, a bunch of Europeans came to back then, which was just a plot of land on the other side of the Atlantic. And there were a lot of European powers fighting for control. And turns out, lo and behold, there are already some people there. They called them Indians, erroneously. Now we call them Native Americans. But there were already people that were on this land. They were there first. And the interesting thing is that Native Americans didn't actually even believe that you could own land. They thought it was a ridiculous concept. How could you even own land? Owning a piece of the earth, it's like owning a piece of air. It just didn't make any sense to them. And yet here are all these Europeans, these light-skinned fellows coming in and kind of claiming land and territory. And hell, they were there first. What are these people doing? And you have to imagine that at a certain point, you keep pushing deeper and deeper into somebody's land. You keep kind of invading somebody's territory. And eventually there's going to be consequences. And eventually there were. And there was struggle, there was conflict. And in many instances, there was violent conflict. And there were battles and massacres and, European settlers who eventually became American colonists on the land now known as the United States of America. Were getting massacred and getting killed by Indians. It became a war. People got together, tried to defend themselves. And in some cases, the conflict was peaceful. In some cases, there's no conflict at all. And in certain instances, there's very violent conflict. And people said, we got to do something about this. And it took a long time, but eventually they did. And the government of the United States sent in the military and started waging war. And war is kind of a polite way to put it. It wasn't really war so much as it was genocide. We know this now. It's not the most comfortable thing to discuss. It's not the happiest chapter of U.S. history, but it is what it is. The government of the United States essentially waged genocide against Native Americans, indiscriminately killing everybody they could. That was the solution. Just round them all up and kill them. If you got red skin, you're no good. Kill them all. Round them up, kill them all. And then whoever the few guys left over, round them up and stick them off in the corner of some desert somewhere and let them live out the rest of their days and be thankful that we didn't kill them too. And that was the way they dealt with it back then. And I'm sure there's some people thinking, yeah, let's do that. Sounds great. That's a great solution. But again, even though the emotion is totally understandable, the anger, the feeling of helplessness, the sadness, the desperation, the depression of even losing loved ones and seeing these things happen, the emotional decisions that come from those tend to not be good decisions. And especially when you declare war, when you commit the lives and livelihoods of people, current and future generations, to the cost of total war and the consequent genocide that it absolutely, that all this absolutely demands, that level heads must prevail. Not emotional decisions, but rational, reasonable, level-headed decisions. And it's never an easy thing. It's never so black and white. We say, oh, we're going to put a circle on a map and bomb all those people and that's it. Because it's just not how it works. You can't just decide, oh, let's get rid of ISIS and, we'll only kill the bad people. That's just not how it works. Which means that all these decisions have consequences. You cannot expect to make a decision, particularly an emotional decision, that has such serious effects to say, let's go to war, let's bomb them, and not expect that that's, and expect that that's a consequence-free decision. Of course there are consequences. There are consequences to every decision. And many of the consequences affect you. Many of them affect other people. The refugee situation is one case in point. There are refugees coming from all over the place. And now the barriers are going up and the doors closed. Say, we don't want any refugees. Refugees stay out. And you got a bunch of people now. They're getting bombed because, of course, by the way, France has been bombing ISIS and all these places in the Middle East for a year. A year they've been bombing. And everybody's been bombing, just constant, nonstop bombing. You have people that want to flee these war zones, and they say, no, we don't want any refugees. And it's kind of interesting, go back and look at the statistics. In 1938, only 4.9% of Americans in 1938 said, yes, let's allow refugees from Germany and Austria into the United States. And in January 1939, just months before Hitler invaded Poland, 61% of Americans said, no, we don't want Jewish children into the United States who are fleeing Germany. Months before. And of course, now we know. We know what happened to all of them. Anne Frank was denied refugee status. Her family was denied refugee status over and over and over again. She became an icon for genocide. There are consequences to these decisions. And the decision, this is the thing that kind of blows my mind, is that the decision is always the same one. It's more war and less freedom. Let's drop more bombs on brown people and let's take away more freedoms from our citizens at home. And it's the only way the governments know how to deal with it. And when that way fails and there's another attack, it's more the same. It's more the same. It's the same tactic over and over again. They say, oh, let's have a war for 14 years. And turned out all that stuff we did wasn't effective because now we have another attack. So what do? Let's have even less freedom. Let's drop even more bombs because this time we'll really get it done. And it just doesn't make any sense to keep trying the same thing over and over again. The only time that makes sense is when you're emotional. If you're rational and you step back and you look at the big picture and say, wait a minute, hold on. Haven't we tried this over and over and over and over and over again and it doesn't work? It doesn't work. More war. It's this constant cycle, never-ending cycle of war and violence. And the government steps in and says, no, give us more responsibility, give us more power, and we'll fix it. Wait a minute, aren't these the same people that spent hundreds of millions of dollars to build a website that didn't work? These are the same people that couldn't deliver bottles of water to hurricane victims in New Orleans? These are the guys who consistently can't get it right, and now the solution is more power, more debt, more bombs? If you look at it from a rational perspective, it doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make any sense. And they just keep coming back to the same thing, and the same assumptions over and over and over again, that this is the way you do it, and so on and so forth. My own view, frankly, is the thing that defeats extremism and radicalism and terrorism, all these things, ultimately is prosperity. Prosperity is the universal tool that lifts everybody. I mean, think about it. If somebody's got, you get some angry young man and suddenly he's got a beautiful wife and beautiful children and a nice lifestyle and a good job that he likes, doing something that he feels is important, and he has dignity and integrity, and he's got some savings that isn't being, manipulated away into nothingness. He's got a good livelihood, and he feels that his children are going to get even a better shot. And who wants to screw that up? I mean, no sane person wants to screw that up. I mean, and it's one of these things. I mean, who's going to go strap a bomb to his chest and say, "Oh, let me blow myself up and do away with all this great stuff"? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. Prosperity is the thing that fixes everybody's situation. As long as people are free to live and work and prosper and do better and have a better life and ensure their children have better lives, it works more than war. It works more than bombs. And the only tactic now is to say, okay, well, we've been dropping bombs on people. We've been invading foreign countries. We've been killing, blowing up hospitals by remote control. And now there's a consequence. Now there is a consequence. After all this time, there's a consequence. And so the solution is to say, oh, we need to drop more bombs. We need to go and wage more war, as if there won't be more consequences from that. Of course there will be more consequences. The only thing you can hope is to say, well, I hope we can wage as much genocide as quickly as possible. I hope we can just kill every last one of them. Let's kill every brown person on the planet. And if we can just kill every brown person on the planet faster than they can have another attack, then maybe we'll win. I mean, that's the sense of it right now. And it just doesn't work. It doesn't compute. That's not the way the world works. There's no huge group of ISIS sitting around in the middle of the desert with no innocent people around with a big sign that says, "Please bomb me." That's just not how it works. And we enter back into the same cycle, more war, more violence, brought to you by the people that couldn't get bottled water into New Orleans. Now, how safe does that make you feel? Because it doesn't make me feel very safe. Governments can't fix this. And at the end of the day, it comes down to personal decision. It's one of those things, again, you look at the numbers. Just look at the numbers. If you can disconnect the emotion, which I understand it's incredibly strong, the fear is so primal. God, it's so primal. We do things so much out of fear. The only thing that's more powerful than fear is hope. These are the two most powerful emotions that we have. And we're terrified of terrorists. Fear is so strong, almost as strong as the hope that we can beat them by following the same tactics over and over again. Two incredibly strong emotions that propel us into a cycle of emotional decisions, which tend to be bad, expensive decisions that don't produce the results that we want. The results that we want is no more violence. And it's been 14 years, trillions of dollars, tens of thousands of people dead, and we still have violence. We still have attacks. Is it worth it? Does it make sense? If you can disconnect yourself from the emotion, you can see it just doesn't work. The reality is, the choice comes down to each of us, whether or not we choose to live in fear, and whether or not we choose to do something ourselves about that fear. The normal solution is to outsource it to government. Again, to the people that can't deliver bottles of water, who spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a website that doesn't work, who consistently fail at everything they do. And we say, let's let those guys solve the problem because they're so good at solving problems. They're the ones who cause the problems. They don't solve problems. They create problems. And I think that's a dangerous thing to do, to say, to say, I'm afraid of something and I want the government to make this problem go away. It was an interesting thing I read. One of the guys on our team here sent me a note and said, look at what's happening now. In the United States, there's some organization that oversees soccer, football. I'll say soccer. I grew up saying soccer, so sorry if you're European. I'm going to say soccer. But overseas soccer, all the little kids running around, playing soccer in their little leagues and all this stuff. And now they've decided that, heading the ball, using your head to hit the ball in soccer, something people have been doing. Look, soccer's Sport's been around for thousands of years. It's played by hundreds of millions of people around the world. Yet now this governing body in the United States has decided that heading the ball is too dangerous. And so now they've banned it. There's no more heading in the land of the free. Can't head the ball anymore. It's too dangerous for children. Now, I played soccer when I was a kid. Actually, I wasn't very good. For whatever reason, they had the insane presence of mind to stick me in as goalkeeper in one game, and that was my big play. Was I managed to actually? There's some kid running down. God, he was on a tear, and he was dribbling the ball, and I just socked it right at me, and I stuck my head out, and I actually blocked it with my face. That was my big play. In all the years I played soccer, I was always much better at the individual sports, anyways. But somehow I managed to make it to the age of 37, sitting here talking to you, and didn't scramble too many of my brain cells. But now it's just too dangerous. And I remember reading this story, thinking, what are they teaching kids by this? They're teaching kids to say, "Oh, the world is too dangerous for you." And it's a great way of training people to cower in fear, while you let the authority go and sort out your problems for you, as opposed to just realizing, there's just danger in the world. Sometimes you just got to take a freaking risk. Just take a chance. There's things out there that sometimes, you might get hit in the face with a ball from time to time. It's just going to happen. But we can't have that. So instead, they got to put a bubble around everybody. And this is what we teach children now. They teach kids, you got to live in a bubble, and too many problems, too many risks, and you just got to let the authorities handle all this stuff for you. And now you got an entire generation that grows up thinking that this is how you solve problems. You solve problems by letting the authorities decide that you can't do things, by taking away your freedom. That's the lesson. And to me, that's entirely the wrong direction. That's entirely the wrong move, and that's how we end up in situations like this. We end up in a cycle of more war, more violence, emotional decisions that are incredibly costly and just don't work out. Because we end up in the same place over and over again, whether it's a year or 6 months or 6 years or 15 years, whatever it is, we end up in the exact same place over and over and over again. And the thing that it's not a comfortable reality. I'll be the first to admit. But let's be honest. If there's somebody who's in whatever big city right now who's saying, "I'm terrified there's going to be a terrorist attack in this city," and you really think it's that likely, and you really think it's that strong of a likelihood, even though look, the numbers are what they are, and yeah, sure, any number of things can happen. But if it's really that much of a concern, even though the statistics are what they are, and you think I'm in XYZ city and I'm really afraid, then what are you still doing there? I mean, what if you're that afraid? What are you still there for? And it's something I don't mean it in a bad way, but again, the idea of outsourcing this problem to be solved by an institution that consistently fails, and I'm not talking about the military. Speaking from personal experience, I would say that the U.S. military is probably the greatest, most technologically advanced, most well-trained, potentially in the history of the world. It's incredible. But I'm not talking about people that pull the trigger. I'm talking about their bosses, the guys that wear suits and write papers on public policy about all these sorts of things that make these decisions. The same people that make decisions on every other policy that continue to destroy the nation. That's what we're talking about. We're going to outsource solving the problem to those guys. And we're going to expect that that's a consequence-free decision. Of course it's not a consequence-free decision. France has been dropping bombs for a year. That has consequences. And now they've realized the consequences. You drop bombs on hospitals and schools and all these things, and whether or not you meant it, there's going to be consequences. You cannot make a decision like this and not expect consequences. And so now the decision's been made, whether you agree with it or not, and the entire the world is on war footing. And people say, "I'm terrified to be in this city." Well, you know what? There are a lot of options out there. There really are. Nobody wants to live in fear, and rather than, if the choice is to say, "I can stay here and live in fear. Option one. Option two is I can live in my I could live in this completely alternate reality where there's no consequence to these actions and just pretend like there's nothing going on. It's all fine. That's behind door number two. Behind door number three is why don't I do something about it? Maybe I'll go somewhere else. If I'm that afraid, if I'm that concerned, beyond the statistical likelihood, maybe I'll go somewhere else. There's a lot of places in the world where they're not dropping bombs. There's a lot of places in the world where you can feel peaceful, at peace, and more free, and watch it on television instead of out of your bedroom window. And I don't have to be concerned about these things. And it might be a cold thing to say, but it's true. Because the idea of just saying, I'm going to outsource this to my government, it's never that black and white. You talk about people that consistently fail to accomplish what they set out to do, even if it's with the best of intentions. Say, we want to protect people. Great, nice thing to say. We want to protect people. And they consistently fail to do what they set out to achieve. And in doing so, they make the world more dangerous. There's more debt, there's more spending, there's more chaos, there's more all these things. They consistently fail to achieve. And their own track record shows that they aren't accomplishing what they set out to do. And they create more and more and more consequences. And even still, the statistical likelihood is very low. But if it's that much of a concern, there are things that you can do. Or you just have to accept the risk. I spent a lot of time in Chile. There's a big risk in Chile. The big risk here is earthquakes. We're in the earthquake zone here. And that's just one of those things that I have to accept in living here. Making the decision to be here is not consequence-free. There are consequences to those decisions. One of these consequences is that I have to accept a certain level of risk. And that risk that I have to accept is that I'm in the earthquake zone. And I've taken steps to mitigate that risk. I have a lot of preparation set aside. I've got food and water and the ability to produce my own food and water. And I've got, well-constructed dwellings and all these things can stand up to all that. And I've got a lot of things that I've done to mitigate that risk. But it's a decision that I've had to make consciously to say, there's a risk in being here. I've chosen to accept that risk and I've done things to actually mitigate that risk. That's a rational approach to this. Not an emotional approach to say, I'm going to throw my hands up and let the government fix the earthquake problem. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? It's just as ridiculous as saying I want them to fix the hot dog problem. All of this together, when I was sitting there on Friday night, actually, with a friend, and we were reading about all of this, and my friend said, he said, dark days. And you could make that argument. There are an unbelievable amount of problems in the world. This is one of them. I mean, there's a refugee crisis, there's a terror crisis, there's financial crises. Banks are ridiculously poorly capitalized, very illiquid. Governments are bankrupt. All these things are happening all at the same time. Financial markets are in a massive bubble. The entire financial system is a massive bubble. China's fighting off this huge depression. Markets all over the world. Currencies are in major slide. There's recessions. All these things are happening all at the same time. You think, man, dark days. But I actually disagree with that. I disagree with that because in spite of all of this, I'm actually still incredibly optimistic. And yeah, there's some nasty things going on. It really sucks that, people, that's angry young guys who want to go and blow people up, but they're out there in the world. That's horrible. It's a horrible thing. But there's so much more out there that's so much better news. There's so much great stuff that's happening out there. There's so much incredible technology that's being created. There's so much that human beings are accomplishing. And no matter what happens, all these cycles in history, and yeah, I'm the first person to say this. Nations are going bankrupt, and that stuff happens throughout history. The financial system is changing. That happens. The currencies are rising and falling. Reserve currencies are going away, and other places are rising. There's this massive debt bubble that's about to burst. And yet the one trend in history that supersedes all of that, the decline of the dominant superpower, the decline of the dominant reserve currency, massive change and reset in the financial system, the one trend that supersedes all of that is the rise of humanity. That no matter what happens, human beings rise. Human beings adapt and overcome. Human beings succeed. We rise. And I always think about this whenever I start our entrepreneurship camps every summer. I always give a presentation. I usually conclude with that story from Steve Jobs when he was talking about how he was reading this magazine, I think it was Scientific American, and saying that, it was the article was talking about how much energy different species in the animal kingdom expend getting from point A to point B. Lions and tigers and hippos and so forth, they have to spend a lot of calories moving and so forth. And I think he said it was the condor that was the most efficient locomotion, expended the least amount of energy, the fewest calories, moving from point A to point B. Elegant and efficient, and would just kind of flap their wings and glide along effortlessly. And human beings were way down on the list. And then what they did was they actually did the study again, looking at human beings on a bicycle. And if you put a human being in his natural environment, just walking around, spends a lot of energy getting from point A to point B. You put a human being on a bicycle, and suddenly it was effortless. It was now human beings gliding along effortlessly, getting from point A to point B, spending very little energy. And as he would talk about this, Steve Jobs saying that was incredibly impactful for him because it reinforced this idea through his entire life that human beings were fundamentally tool creators. We take something that's bad and we make it better. And that's the situation here, is that the more bad there is in the world, fundamentally, the more opportunity there is. It's critical that we take rational steps to protect ourselves from the things that we see that are obvious risks, real risks. And again, sure, terrorism and terror attacks and all these things are really scary. Statistically speaking, you're far more likely to have your savings vanquished because your bank is illiquid and poorly capitalized. It's far more likely that your IRA will be confiscated, your retirement funds will be confiscated. It's far more likely that, your currency will go into some period of crisis because your central bank is actually insolvent. If you look at risks, these things are actually far more likely. And sure, there are other things in terms of maybe even physical safety and so forth. These things are far more likely, and it makes sense from a rational perspective to take a wholesale, rational look at risks and take steps to mitigate those risks. And the amazing thing is that all the tools and all the resources and all this new technology is available to protect ourselves from these bad things that are happening in the world. The solutions are there. And that's something that's incredibly exciting, and one of the reasons why I'm so optimistic. And the other reason I'm optimistic is because wherever there's something that's bad, wherever there's something that's negative, wherever there's chaos, there's always opportunity. There's always the opportunity to turn that into something good. And there's a lot of that out there. There's a lot of things going on that are so positive. There's a lot of opportunity to do things that are positive. And that's why I'm so optimistic. And I think it's a more powerful emotion than fear. It's a more helpful emotion than fear. And I would really encourage everybody to consider that. And even though that fear can kind of take hold of us, just to always try and step back and let the rational side of our brain kick in, particularly when we have to make decisions that affect lives and livelihood, future generations and so forth. Makes all the sense in the world. Take a rational perspective and never forget that human beings always rise. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.